Chapter 35. M2 had hidden inside the grotto for more than 24 hours. On its first night of being, it had consumed humans, flora, snakes, spiders, birds, and insects. It had devoured them with reckless abandon until it reached sentience. The realization of the island's natural boundaries dissuaded it from destroying the rest of the terrestrial biome. It holed up during the daylight hours, snaking its tendrils into the dirt and soil, waiting. On its third night of existence, as dawn threatened to overtake the horizon, it had sensed something. Another. An entity large enough for it to feel. Before it could get into the water and find the other, the feeling disappeared, creating a rift in the creature's consciousness for a brief moment. M2 retreated, flowing to the furthest depths of the 10-meter-long cave. If forced, it could retreat into the shining, damaged lifeboat that bobbed impotently in the muted current. The top portion of the collar had shattered when the pirates had tried to bring it aboard. By that time, M2 had already infected one of them. It had finished the night's hunt, destroying a few remaining collections of brain coral and the unwary fish feeding on their waste. It hadn't bothered to try and grow. The biome would need to heal to provide more sustenance. What's more, something had destroyed the other. Grotto M2 knew what danger was, both instinctively and logically. Its awareness and intelligence grew with each particle it consumed and added to itself. Grotto M2 wanted to survive, but needed to become. As it flowed back to its shelter, it felt the vibration of the Zode's motors through the water. It recognized the wavelength for what it was, the creatures that had found it and freed it from its floating prison of metal and light. They might have freed it, but they were dangerous. However, consuming them made Grotto M2 more aware and intelligent. It wanted them, but it had hardly any time before the light filled the world and forced it to hide. It would have to be quick. It flowed into its shelter where it could change its form in safety. It didn't have words for the images it imagined, only their function and associated concepts. It had consumed spiders, crabs, and fish, and had devoured mammals and birds. It had stored their physiology and knew how to shape itself into any conglomeration necessary. The cave echoed with the crackle and spit of limbs forming and extruding, eye clusters and stalks emerging and waving in the breeze. Its color turned matte black with a thin armor that it could quickly enhance as needed. It needed to be quick, consume its quarry, and return to its shelter. When it dragged itself out of the grotto, it immediately saw movement on the ship's deck. As M2 coiled to spring, projectiles struck its armor. The creature leaped, its form changing as it landed on the ship's deck. The pirate ship's aft rose in the air, its bow diving beneath the ocean. Alan goosed the engines, and the Zode leaped forward a few meters, his head snapping around to look at the aft. The ship's bow popped out of the water, and the aft slammed back into the ocean surface. The sound of bullets striking metal caught his ears, but he knew they weren't bullets. That was the sound of a Goliath tarantula scrambling across a sheet of tin, each limb making a ting sound. The spider was on the ship. "Rags! Sarah!" Alan shouted over the comms.
"Alan!"
Rags yelled back.
"I'm in the hold with—"
The sound of her voice was lost to the rattle of automatic gunfire. The flashes reflected off the cliff wall, and Alan heard the creature scrabbling, the ship's hull rocking with the movement. He reached into his go bag and pulled one of the last AP grenades. "Okay, dumbass," Hippie said in his mind. "Now that you've got that, what are you going to do with it?" "Sarah!" Alan yelled when the gunfire briefly paused. He imagined she was reloading. A metallic bang split the air, and then Alan heard the sound of steel bending and tearing. Whatever the fuck was happening on deck, it sounded like the spider was ripping open a tin can. Maybe Sarah was too tired to be frightened. Perhaps her nervous system had managed to find one final dose of adrenaline before her glands gave the fuck up and left her to die. Or maybe it was the sight of the terrified kid who couldn't be more than 10, who'd been forced to lay in his own shit and trussed up like a turkey awaiting slaughter. Regardless, her rifle rattled, and phosphorus rounds punched into the thing's legs and the cephalothorax. 2 bullets struck an eye cluster, marring the creature's surface with glowing phosphorus dots. Each area burned and then exploded in a cloud of crumbs and flame. The spider thing jerked backward from the explosions, pieces of its body shattering, and a rain of diamonds pattered down to the deck. Sarah leaped to the hatch leading to the cabin. Half a beat later, the thing landed atop the wheelhouse, 2 of its remaining limbs cutting through the relatively thin metal as if it were a beer can. She was more than a meter from the nearest one, but its knife-like tip had nearly reached where her head would have been. She snap-aimed and fired at each of the knife-like tips that squirmed against the metal to widen the punctures. The nearest protrusion disappeared without smoke or fire, the bullet merely crashing through dead, solid chitin. The second did much the same, but shattered the tip into black crumbs. Sarah crouched and moved to the stairs leading to the engine room. When she was half a meter from it, she heard the familiar crackle of M2 changing its physiology. The sound had come from behind her. She whirled, rifle raised to her shoulder, eyes instantly searching for a target. A thick eye stalk poked through the shattered window on the starboard side. A crackle from port. She flicked her eyes and saw another one, but unlike the first slender stalk, the trunk continued to grow. Shimmering diamonds sprouted across the appendage, its chitin changing from an off-black to that of cigarette ash. A whitish-gray limb crackled from the trunk, its tip more like a scythe than a talon. Other shapes moved and writhed beneath the base, and a pair of diamond-encrusted mandibles took form, clicking together in an alien rat-a-tat-tat. "Hi," she said, firing a 3-round burst nearly point-blank into the thickening trunk while turning toward the stairs. Diamond dust puffed out, along with black crumbs and shards that tinkled on the hardwood and against the steel. Sarah tumbled forward, caught her balance, and ran down the steps. Her foot caught the step Rags had broken, and she fell forward, barely catching herself enough to keep from landing face first. Hot pain screamed across her shoulder, and something popped inside, eliciting a throat-ripping shriek. Despite the eye-watering pain shooting through her nervous system, she scrambled forward, her left foot painfully warm and throbbing. As she managed a painful crouch, something smashed into the top of the landing. She turned at the hip and swiveled her head. The thick trunk had moved inside by growing limbs and pulling itself through the ripped sheet metal roof and walls. It stood in the middle of the cabin, its mass pulsing and crackling as new multi-jointed legs grew from its base. Sarah shifted her gaze back in front of her. Foreign writing and a symbol covered an ancient sign on the wall, so old it was practically illegible due to grime and rust. While she didn't understand what it said, she knew what a gear icon meant. She grabbed the handle and pulled herself through the hatch, slamming it shut behind her. A moment later, what sounded like a dozen axes began pounding at the watertight hatch. "Rags," Sarah said over the comms. "Get out of the hold and get to Alan, now!" She panted hard, her words breathy and barely comprehensible to herself. M2 had nearly gotten her again, and now she was trapped like a fucking rat. Rags had moved both the boy and his mother off the ladder. She stood on the first rung, as high as she could go without banging her head, and held a hand to the handle. The woman rattled in pidgin, and Rags didn't catch many of the frantic syllables, but knew Mama was telling her to get the fuck away from the hatch. Rags held a finger to her lips. The hull shook, and the squeal of metal being torn apart hurt her ears. More shots rang out, and the ship canted hard to starboard before swaying back and forth like a slowing rocking chair. The woman screamed, and the boy's whimpers turned into silent sobs. Rags managed to keep her balance and moved her hand to the latch. The metal squeal sounded again, followed by another burst of gunfire.
"Rags,"
Sarah said over the headset. She was panting and sounded in pain amidst a wash of static.
Get to Alan, now!"
Rags took a deep breath and met Mama's eyes. "We go, now!" A blank stare wouldn't have surprised Rags, but the woman seemed to understand what she meant, and Mama wasn't happy about it. Rags pushed hard against the hatch, lifting it upward and sliding it partway open. She grabbed the lip with her free hand, gritting her teeth against the horror movie playing in her mind that included taloned, segmented legs punching through the gap and impaling her head. When the opening was wide enough, she went up another rung and cautiously cleared the area. The cabin in front of her was a complete wreck. The roof had caved in atop the winch controls. Supports had buckled, leaving the front half of the ruined cabin canted and twisted. Rags pushed hard and the hatch slid aside. She scrambled up the ladder, immediately dropped her arms, and extended her hands. "Give me the boy!" Rags shouted at the woman. Between the surf and the sound of the creature still scrabbling and destroying the lower deck of the ship, Rags could barely hear the woman's sob. She lifted her boy to the ladder, and he tentatively climbed, Rags's fingers waggling at him in encouragement. He managed the first 3 rungs before she leaned in and pulled him off the ladder. She immediately curled the shaking boy to her shoulder. "Come!" she gestured to the woman. Mama didn't so much as pause. Before the survivor climbed the first 2 rungs, Rags had already pulled her pistol and faced the remains of the cabin. The section nearest the bow jumped and pulsed like a cat stalking beneath a sheet. "Sarah!" Rags called as she ushered the woman aft. "We're out of the hold and heading to Salty." A moment later, Sarah said in a thankful, exhausted voice, her words fading in and out of the static.
"Copy. Tell me. Moment. Off the ship."
Rags didn't like the sound of that, but continued moving aft. Adeline waited in the Zode below, the craft touching the ship's platform. At least something was going right. A loud crash shook the ship, and Rags's feet vibrated. The damned creature was tearing through everything. The woman took an eternity to climb down the ladder. Before Mama stepped aboard the Zode, Rags had already scrambled down to the platform, the boy still expertly cradled in her arms. She stepped into the Zode, immediately handing off the boy to his nearly hysterical mother. Rags unslung her rifle and walked to the dais. Alan goosed the throttle, and Salty's electric motors whined, the boat quickly accelerating away from the ship and further out to sea. "Sarah!" Rags said over the comms. "We're clear!" Sarah didn't respond. Rags called again. No response. "Alan?" He pulled the transmitter and hailed her. No luck. He racked the transmitter and kept his eyes forward as he slowly opened the throttle. "Going to get a little distance," he said. "We've got incoming." "What?" Rags asked. "What kind?" "Thermobarics," Alan said. "They're taking out the doy." She blinked. "Jesus cunting Christ!" He nodded. "Not a goddamn thing we can do about it either." The engine compartment stank of diesel and rot. With M2 pounding on the hatch with what sounded like multiple sledgehammers, Sarah could barely think. She wasn't sure who had designed the engine compartment, but it hadn't been made for more than 2 people. She wasn't even sure 2 of the animals could fit in here at the same time. She quickly found the switch to turn on the lights, and once they came to life, she pulled out the night vision goggles and blinked away the brief afterimage. With real light, it was easier to make out the details of the crowded space, although there wasn't much to see apart from the massive engines, leaking oil, and the stench of diesel. The hatch squealed in its frame, and Sarah whirled to face it. One edge bulged. Fuck! M2 might not be able to break the bar holding the hatch in place, but nothing kept it from stressing the hinges until they shattered. She idly wondered if M2 had transformed some of its limbs back into good old black liquid so it could damage the metal, weaken it, and make it more vulnerable. "Focus, boss." Givens again. "Focus. Right." She examined the fuel lines heading into the engine. Oil, diesel, phosphorus. She knew diesel wouldn't catch fire without a significant heat source, but Willie Pete would be more than enough to solve that problem. The only issue was that 10 seconds after pulling the pin, she'd burn along with the diesel. "M2 will too," she thought. "Hopefully." "You really willing to end your life for a maybe, boss? Thought you knew better." The hatch took a particularly savage blow and rattled in the frame. The corner had peeled back, and the room's ambient light showed her a black eye staring at her. "You could get lost in there," she thought. "Just let the abyss look into you, become one with it, float away and let—" She broke the gaze, her eyes falling to the dingy deck at her feet. "Don't look at that again," she told herself, "or it really will be over." Ignoring the thing on the other side of that hatch and the telltale crackle of morphing and extruding appendages, she stared upward at the ceiling. An off-color panel, so streaked with oil and soot that it was nearly invisible, caught her eye. She quickly moved to the far corner and stared up at the hatch, if you could call it that. The lever had been partially shorn off as though it had rusted through. The room shook from another concentrated attack. Sarah turned her head and saw 2 ash-colored, uncanny humanoid hands prying at the edge of the hatch and the peeled portion of steel. The creature was going to rip away the goddamn hatch.
"Set.
The radio cut out for a second.
Clear."
Clear. That was all she needed to hear. Sarah unslung her rifle and beat the overhead latch with the butt. After 2 near misses, she finally struck the metal, the lever snapping like a dry twig. She leaped and smashed the butt upward at the same time and hit the panel. The metal groaned in protest, but buckled slightly. Another smash, and the panel popped free. She glanced behind her just in time to see a skeletal, oversized hand with 7 digits reaching through the half-broken hatch for her legs. Sarah's throat burned from the involuntary scream that leaped out of her mouth. She jumped upward, grabbed the edge of the open ceiling panel with her hands, and rose 1/2 meter from the floor. Something clipped her left foot, and a lightning bolt of pain shot up her spine. She gave herself a bit of slack before pulling as hard as she could. She popped upward and over the edge of the panel, her legs scrambling for purchase, left foot pulsing with an angry ache. Sarah rolled to the side and rose to her crouch, surprised that her left foot held her weight. A glance down proved it was still there, but the boot had a rip in the side, a thin trickle of blood staining the deck. The ship shuddered beneath her, and a massive crash filled the air. She stumbled backward and fell to her ass less than 2 meters from the ship's bow. The same skeletal hand that had reached for her shot up through the rectangular opening in the deck. The long, multi-jointed fingers searched for her, waving slowly back and forth and scouring the metal. Another grinding sound filled the air, and the ship vibrated beneath her. She moved backward, her hands pulling, feet scrabbling. The limb moved forward, but still didn't seem to know where she was. She was 1 meter from the bow and 2 meters from the fingers. She managed to rise to a crouching position, her left foot awake and sending tingling pain through her toes. After fumbling with the sling, she held the rifle and aimed at the closest finger. The air crackled, and one of the knuckles on the nearest finger rose a few centimeters before expanding, the ashy color fading to matte black. The bump moved a few more centimeters before becoming an eye stalk, the orb staring at her with its abyssal gaze. The hand pivoted, the skeletal digits gaining mass and thickening, their color draining from ash to a dull brown. New appendages appeared at the thing's base, spreading across the hole leading to the engine room and giving the creature leverage. The thing was flowing from below decks and up here. Any second, the rest of its mass would join it, and she'd face the entire creature. As if the thing heard her thoughts, it raised itself and pointed the hand's malformed palm at her. The center melted from solid armor into a glistening maw with jagged, diamond teeth. An eye stalk bent toward her like the lure of a lanternfish, the orb at its end spinning. The maw extruded outward from the thing's mass, its jaws snapping at the air with the sound of crunching bones. Sarah pulled the phosphorus grenade and braced her rifle with her forearm, her index finger pulling the pin. "Well, fuck you too," she yelled, tossed the grenade at the hole in the deck, and ran for the gunwale. As she reached the edge of the railing, Sarah turned, snap-aimed, and fell backward, trigger finger held down, phosphorus rounds streaking toward the blackish thing, dissolving the deck. She felt as though she hung there for several seconds, although it was for less than 3 heartbeats. The moment she lost view of the creature, the world became white. Chapter 36. The wild burst from Sarah's AR skated off armor and flew into the darkness, or peppered the deck. Grotto M2 didn't know about phosphorus or what a grenade was. In short, Grotto M2 wasn't prepared. Its lightly armored feet stepped on burning phosphorus dots, the superheated metal instantly transforming a portion of its shell into crumbs. M2 felt the damage and immediately cauterized the leg, effectively amputating it. The phosphorus continued to burn through and into what lay beneath the leg's armor. Pure, undiluted, unprotected M2. The leg detonated, creating a massive rent in the metal and wooden deck. M2 reached in confusion for the falling human, but it was too slow to catch her. The object the human had tossed bounced on the deck and fell directly into the engine room. One of M2's legs transformed into a pincer and picked the object up from the deck just as everything turned into bright, white light. The phosphorus grenade exploded in the cramped engine space, spraying the entire room with white powder that immediately ignited. Pinpricks of the 2,000 degrees Celsius substance obliterated M2's shell and set fire to itself. The phosphorus burned through the fuel lines, and the diesel immediately exploded in a fireball. The ship's port side hull blew outward, flaming metal and wooden debris blasting out into the air to burn on the water. M2 disappeared without a trace, every particle of itself annihilated in the white, smoky flames. The ocean rushed through the massive rent in the hull, quelling the burning wood but not the phosphorus. The ship, once a prize among the pirates that occasionally terrorized the Doi, quickly sank in a shroud of bubbles. The explosion rocked the world, causing Alan's skull to pulse with a deep ache. The boy and his mother cried out, as did Rags. Impossible to blame them. He'd moved the Zode far enough away just in case something like this happened. In a way, he wished he'd been further away. It had been impossible to see what had happened from their vantage point. They'd heard the sounds of crunching and squealing metal and gunfire, and then a flash of white had pierced the receding darkness like a ball of lightning. Pillars of fire and thick clouds of whitish smoke billowed into the air. Alan hit the transmitter. "Sarah, sound off." No response. He maneuvered the craft until he was parallel with the port hull but still 100 meters from the burning ship. Jesus, Rags said. She pulled up a pair of binoculars and was scanning. Blew the shit out of it. Any sign? Rags was quiet for a moment, the binoculars moving with barely perceptible motion as she expertly panned the area. No movement, she said, and that ship's going to sink damned quick. Fuck. He opened the throttle again and headed until he was parallel to where the ship's bow had been before the explosion. Rags, I'm going to move in. Arm up. She said nothing, but he heard the sound of her unslinging her rifle. He barely noticed as he opened the throttle again, only this time he headed inland. The mother said something in talk or pidgin that he didn't understand, a shiver underlying each incomprehensible syllable. She was probably asking him why the fuck he was going back. When the Zoe was within 50 meters of the sinking ship, he cut the throttle to 1/4 and brought the craft perpendicular to the target. Rags would have more of a field of view this way, and so would he. As he pulled up the spare pair of binoculars, the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, wrecking his night vision and leaving him seeing stars. The mother slowly rose from her seat and shaded her eyes against the light, fresh, joyful tears streaking through the grime remaining on her face. The boy started sobbing again, in relief. Alan turned his attention back to the water, his eyes searching the ocean surface for anything that didn't belong. The problem was that many things didn't belong. Ripped and torn pieces of aluminum, plastic, wood, some burning, some not, among other debris. He thumbed the transmitter again. Sarah, sound off. Nothing. He turned salty again and headed closer. The ship's bow had risen high in the water, the rest of the waterlogged craft dragging it down. A pool of blackish oil rose to the surface. Alan opened his mouth to say something, but Rags had already primed a magnesium flare and tossed it into the pool. The oil lit immediately, black smoke curling into the air to join the slowly dissipating clouds of phosphorus smoke. When it didn't explode, Alan heaved a sigh. Just oil and diesel from whatever hadn't been consumed aboard the ship. Good. Alan, keep moving east. He didn't ask why, but changed the boat's attitude and kept the throttle 1/8 open. Salty moved slowly, the electric motors barely audible. The woman whispered to her child, arms still closed around her waist, her face practically buried in his small shoulder.
Salty,
Kojo asked over the comms. Alan pulled the transmitter. Go.
We saw an explosion. Wanted to make sure it wasn't you. Over.
Normally, Alan would have grinned at that. Not us. Target destroyed, we think. We're in search and rescue mode. Over. The pause was short, but he noticed it.
We also have an inbound update. 20 minutes until the thermobarics. Over.
Alan nodded to himself. Copy. Out. Doesn't leave us much time, Rags whispered to the breeze. The sun rose above the hills of New Ireland and bathed the slate water, the color instantly turning to a beautiful transparent green as if someone had flipped a switch. They floated in 15 meters of water, debris from the explosion scattered about the sand. The pirate ship had barely settled on the ocean floor, thick plumes of dust and bubbles rendering it all but invisible. The woman yelled something, and Alan turned his head. She stood from her seat, the boy hugging her waist, and pointed north. Alan followed her finger and saw something floating inland with the tide. He turned the boat and increased the throttle, knowing damned well that it was Sarah. When he was within a few meters, Rags leaped into the water without a word and immediately swam to the floating body. As she reached Sarah, Rags slid alongside her, lifted her head, and supported her. Rags swam with one arm, her feet kicking hard beneath her and Sarah to keep them both buoyant and moving against the tide. Alan moved from the dais to the side, a life ring in his hands. Rags reached the Zode's port pontoon and held onto it with one hand. She conscious? Alan asked. Rags lifted herself and pushed Sarah upward simultaneously. He dropped the ring and put his arms beneath Sarah's armpit before lifting her out of the water and dragging her into the boat. Rags climbed up a second later, her breathing somewhat labored. She didn't twitch, she panted. Alan put his ear to Sarah's lips and felt a slight exhale against his skin. Take her, he said to Rags and headed to the dais. I'm getting us the hell out of here. Sarah awoke to the bump and sway of the Zode as it traveled near its top speed. She opened her eyes and looked directly into Rags's concerned face. Rags blinked at her and smiled. About time, she said. Sarah opened her mouth and tried to speak, but her throat felt as though it were filled with broken glass. Don't move. Sarah twitched her toes and fingers and finally understood where she was. Her head was in Rags's lap, with the rest of her body supine on the deck. Alan? She's awake. Good. Sarah wanted to ask what had happened, but considering she was still alive, she bet M2 had been destroyed. Or at least Alan thought it had been destroyed. Probably. The boat continued at high speed, and Sarah's body tingled with aches and pains. Lying on the deck wasn't comfortable, but it beat trying to float when your body didn't feel like cooperating. The concussive blast had occurred just as she hit the water, sparing her from the worst of the pressure wave. Sarah had found herself tumbling, her rifle flying away from numb hands, and her head pounding with flashes of mental light. Time had become little more than brief moments between green water and darkness, each longer or shorter than the last, marked only by the amount of water she coughed and sputtered as she tried to keep from drowning. She'd heard the sound of the Zode as it approached, but was sure it was nothing more than an auditory hallucination, her brain trying to give her hope even as she faced drowning beneath the waves. Now she was on the Zode and returning to Keko. She hoped Rags still had plenty of painkillers left because she knew she was going to need them. She blanked out again, and when she came to, the Zode's motors were barely audible, and the sound of the water rushing against the hull had ceased. The boat rocked slightly, and she felt the vibration of the Zode knocking against something hard and large. "Sarah?" Rags asked. She opened her eyes and stared up into Rags's face. The woman had slid out from beneath Sarah at some point and loomed over her. "Huh?" she managed. Rags grinned. "Think you can move?" Sarah nodded and tried to lift her neck. Rags quickly placed her hands beneath Sarah's head and shoulders, slowly pulling her into a sitting position. Tired, exhausted, and excruciatingly tight muscles shrieked in her spine and abdomen, leaving her panting and scrunching her eyes. The pain lessened after a moment, and she exhaled through pursed lips. "That hurt." Rags said nothing, but helped Sarah to a standing position. The first few steps were more difficult than she expected, her balance rickety and fragile, and not just from the boat rocking. Rags held her upright while they walked to the boat's aft. Alan had Salty backed up against Keko, requiring Sarah and Rags to make a long single step to reach the ship's diving platform. Rags had to steady Sarah when a swell hit the boat before guiding her to the ladder. "Can you climb?" Stupid question. Of course she could. She hoped. She reached the top of the ladder, and Kojo was waiting for her, a genuine smile on his face. He helped her to the cabin and into a seat. The two survivors from the pirate ship sat on the other side of the cabin, Harper checking them for wounds and speaking softly in a language Sarah didn't understand. The world tried to swim away, but Sarah dug her short fingernails into her palm until she felt pain. Her vision cleared and stabilized once more. She felt the vibration and the grind of the winch. They were stowing Salty. Kojo appeared before her, a metal thermos in his hands. He placed it on the table. "Water and some pick-me-ups. Drink what you can." She nodded to him, but said nothing. The smile on his face faltered. "Sarah, you okay?" She managed to nod, although it made her head want to fall off her neck. Everything hurt. Every goddamn thing. She sipped at the water while Kojo moved about the cabin, preparing supplies and provisions. A nutrition bar hit the table in front of the thermos. He didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. Water, food, nutrients, rest. The woman cradled her son, the smell of shit and urine wafting off of them like the stink from a garbage dump. Shower. They needed a shower and fresh clothes. Sarah's vision tried to cross again, and she fought it back. When she focused, she saw the woman staring at her, gratitude in her dark eyes. For the first time since Sarah and Rags had found the woman and her child, the native grinned, her fingers spreading and collapsing in a wave. Sarah found her own grin and returned the wave. The woman cooed to her child when Harper reappeared with bandages and antiseptic. The triage work continued. When Alan finally appeared in the cabin with Rags, he'd unzipped his wetsuit, the top half flowing out behind him like a cape. Keko's diesel engines rumbled to life. "Okay, people. We're heading away from here, but don't get complacent. The hull may not hold." Kojo blinked at Alan before rattling off a few sentences to the woman. She nodded and whispered something to her boy before pointing at Sarah again and saying something else. Kojo turned to look at Sarah, an amused smile lighting his lips. "She says you're a hero." Sarah nodded to the woman, although it made lightning bolts of pain spike through her skull. The ship lurched to port, turned away from the doy, and headed southeast. Sarah didn't know what was about to happen, but Alan remained at the cabin's hatch, his head outside and looking toward the island. Sarah could see it through the cabin windows, although her view was partially obscured. It wasn't long before she heard the sound of low-flying planes. The buzz continued growing, and she saw the first of the aircraft as it flew over the ship and headed for the island. A moment later, another followed, and another. "What?" she croaked, but she didn't have long to wonder. The first plane seemed to hover over the doy before climbing slightly and berthing something massive from its cargo doors. A parachute opened in the plane's wake, just as another parcel dropped maybe half a click away. More planes followed, each dropping its own parachuted payload. Shortly after the last plane disappeared, its deadly gift lost behind the doy's cliff wall, bright flashes lit the island. Mushroom clouds of billowing fire rose above the doy's tree line, a tidal wave of sinister orange and red spreading through the flora and incinerating anything biological. The doy burned. Another sortie of planes, these obviously military, fired missiles and bombs, each resulting in another portion of the island erupting into waves of flame. Some of the aircraft kept going, probably to the other side of the island, before dropping their payloads. Kojo stood near the window, a hand idly wiping at the tears running down his face. Rags took in a deep breath and loosed a shuddering sigh. They watched the island burn until it was lost behind them. New Ireland slowly came into view, a still green and lush island that hadn't yet fallen to human destruction. Or M2's, for that matter. Sarah leaned back on the bench and fell asleep.